Intel once ruled the chip industry, but while they got comfortable, TSMC and Apple blew right past them. Now they're depending on government money just to survive. Here's how a giant fell.
Two of the most expensive and consequential corporate decisions in modern history hinge on two wildly different numbers. First, a $50 million buyout offer that was laughed out of a room. Second, a $150 billion hardware ecosystem practically handed to a competitor. You've likely heard of the first, Blockbuster refusing to buy Netflix. But the second is just as critical, Intel passing on the mobile revolution and leaving the door wide open for a tiny startup called ARM. It is tempting to look back and assume executives at Blockbuster and Intel were simply foolish, or that their technology was inferior. But that isn't true. They failed because their corporate math was absolutely flawless. When industry leaders use the strict financial metrics that built their past to measure an unpredictable future, they run the risk of calculating their own destruction. Let's rewind to the late 1990s. Intel was at the height of its Wintel monopoly, dominating the personal computer market. Their business relied on pouring billions of dollars into massive, highly complex factories to manufacture physical silicon chips. Around the same time, Blockbuster's business model relied on a punitive stream of late fees collected every time a customer missed a return deadline for those physical VHS tapes. Contrasting these towering physical empires were two scrappy upstarts. Over in California, Netflix was a struggling mail-order DVD company. And over here, in Cambridge, England, ARM was a tiny technology spinout. ARM operated on what is called a fabless IP model. They didn't own expensive factories, and they didn't manufacture their own silicon. They simply designed the blueprints for computer chips and licensed those intellectual property rights to other companies who handled the actual manufacturing. To the titans of the era, these business models didn't compute. Because Netflix and ARM lacked massive physical inventory and capital-intensive factories, the traditional spreadsheets dictated that they were insignificant. In the year 2000, Netflix co-founder Mark Randolph secured a meeting with Blockbuster. His company was burning cash, and he offered to sell Netflix to the video rental giant for a mere $50 million. The executives at Blockbuster listened to the pitch, and then, as Hastings later recalled, they literally laughed him out of the room. Take a look at Blockbuster's revenue breakdown. Their margins relied heavily on punishing customers with late fees. But projecting Netflix's flat-rate subscription model, that lucrative late fee revenue dropped straight to zero, replaced by a slow, unproven flatline. Blockbuster's finance team didn't make a careless mistake. They ran the projections and mathematically proved that the Netflix model would destroy their existing profit margins. They chose to protect their immediate late fee margins, instead of recognizing that the convenience of a mailbox, and eventually the internet, was about to replace the trip to the video store entirely. A few years later, Intel found itself in a remarkably similar boardroom scenario. Steve Jobs pitched them on supplying the processor for a highly secretive upcoming mobile project. Intel CEO at the time, Paul Otellini, handed the project over to his finance-driven team to evaluate Apple's requested price point for the chips. Intel's internal math showed the target price Apple was willing to pay per chip was significantly lower than Intel's projected research and development cost. Assuming this unproven phone would be a niche product, analysts concluded volume would never overcome that initial deficit. Intel had a strict internal policy. They were not interested in businesses that couldn't generate $1 billion of incremental revenue in their first year. Apple's secret project didn't clear that hurdle, so Intel passed. Forced to find another supplier, Apple partnered with Samsung. To get the specific architecture they needed, Apple eventually acquired fabulous design companies that utilized ARM's low-power blueprints. That secretive device was the original 2007 iPhone. It immediately shattered every traditional sales forecast, selling millions of units and creating an entirely new category of consumer electronics. Intel's strict requirement for high immediate margins on every single chip blinded them to the massive scale of the incoming mobile revolution. The fallout from these two decisions was swift. Saddled with nearly $1 billion in debt after being spun off by Viacom, Blockbuster failed to adapt to streaming and filed for bankruptcy. Netflix, meanwhile, leaned entirely into the subscription model, eventually soaring past a valuation of $150 billion. On the hardware side, the iPhone triggered a global explosion in mobile devices. And if we look at this line graph tracking ARM's chip shipments, you can see them curving steadily upward through the early 2000s, driven entirely by their neutral licensing model. But watch what happens at the 2007 marker. Driven by the smartphone boom, that line explodes exponentially upward. ARM's blueprints ended up powering 95% of the world's smartphones, rapidly crossing a staggering 200 billion total chip shipped. Intel would eventually burn through billions of dollars in a desperate failed attempt to break back into the mobile market, while that tiny Cambridge startup quietly captured the hardware ecosystem. Both of these stories illustrate a military maxim that applies perfectly to business. Quantity has a quality all its own. Blockbuster and Intel were staring down a high-volume, highly disruptive future, but they evaluated it using the financial calculators of their high-margin past. Whether you are running a trillion-dollar technology empire or a small local business, relying entirely on the metrics that made you successful yesterday is the easiest way to miss tomorrow. Because if you only measure the future's potential by the margins on your current spreadsheet, eventually you too will be laughed out of the room.
Intel's not done yet, but the window's closing. History's lesson is simple. Stop moving forward and someone else takes your place. Subscribe for more stories like this.